And, as we have an estate case, we go through underwriting, we get this nice policy, and then we get to the end of the time period, and now we have to try to figure out, okay, how do we get this premium into the trust in order to try to fund this life insurance policy that we just got through underwriting. And then oftentimes we start counting crummy beneficiaries and, oh man, we don't have enough kids. So then you start, how do we get this premium in there? One of the solutions for that is that if we use a defective grantor trust, rather than every year trying to figure out how are we going to get premium dollars into the trust, what this strategy is that let's move the asset that produces the cash flow into the trust in a tax effective way. And now we don't have to worry about trying to get premium dollars into the trust on an annual basis. The cash flow is already there inside the trust. So that's kind of one of the big pictures of an intentionally defective grantor trust. So what is a defective trust? What makes it defective? It is an irrevocable trust. It's set up for the benefit of spouse, children, and grandchildren. Those trust assets are outside of the grantor's estate. However, the IRS looks at the trust and the grantor as being one and the same for income tax purposes. And that feature opens up a lot of flexibility for planning for that client. Just like other irrevocable trusts, it is going to be the assets that are in it are have creditor protection, including divorce of some of the trust beneficiaries. The grantor can also write into the trust provision some spendthrift provision. So if they do have some concerns about some of their children being able to handle significant assets, they can write in some provisions to give instructions to the trustee about how income is to be distributed to some of the beneficiaries. The last point is really key. Because it is defective from an income tax perspective, meaning that the trust and the grantor are one and the same in the eyes of the IRS, if we sell assets to the trust, we do not need to recognize gain on that transaction because the IRS says, well, you really just sold the asset to yourself. We haven't really changed a taxpayer ID for income tax purposes, so therefore we don't need to recognize gain. And that is a key provision for this planning. So the benefits that a client gets from that is once we move that asset out of their estate into the trust, now all of that appreciation happens outside the estate. We also get, as we're looking at clients with high net worth, we can't solve that problem through just the unified credit. We can't gift enough assets into a trust, gift assets to next generation, and eliminate an estate tax issue. This is a tax efficient way where we can effectively sell assets to the trust, sell assets to ourselves for income tax purposes, and get those assets out of the estate. And we can do that in a way where if we need to do some planning for the grantor, we can actually make some provisions in there to allow their spouse to have access to income from the assets that are in the trust. So get appreciation out of the estate, don't need to recognize gain on the transaction, and we can still set that up so that if we do need to do some income planning for the grantor and their spouse, we can establish some provisions in the trust to allow them to get income. One of the key provisions of the trust, and one of the features that opens the door for a lot of flexibility down the road, is the grantor has the right to reacquire trust assets and substitute assets of equal value. Again, because the IRS for income purposes says trust and grantor are the same, we have the opportunity to swap assets without having to recognize gain during that transaction. So let's just take a quick example. We start a business. I put into the trust non-voting stock, and the trust and the business takes off. It's now years down the road. The stock is now worth $10 million. I put that stock in early on, so I've got a very, very low basis in that stock. I've been successful in other areas, so I have some cash. I've got $10 million of cash. I have the opportunity to go and replace that stock in the trust with $10 million of cash. So now I've got the stock back. I've got $10 million of cash in the trust. And so when I die, that stock gets a step up in basis and can be passed on to the kids with a higher basis than if I left it in the trust. So tremendous flexibility to not only do estate planning, but also to do some cost basis planning, which, as we pay attention to the conversations that are happening in Washington, cost basis planning may become a bigger part of what we do. So we can accomplish that within a defective trust. We can also borrow from the trust without having to provide adequate interest or security. So again, that kind of falls back to if we need to provide some cash flow back to the grantor or the grantor's spouse, we've got the opportunity to do that without having to put up collateral or other assets in order to receive that loan from the trust. And then again, borrow and failure to repay from the trustee. Again, we're one and the same. So, it's a loan, but it is a loan from ourselves. So for income tax purposes, the interest that is on there is not taxable because it's effectively a loan to ourselves. So what kind of assets are appropriate to put into a defective trust? Certainly any type of closely held business, ideally pass through closely held businesses. So LLC or S Corp stock. Commercial real estate is another excellent asset to put in there. Limited partnership interests, and as well as also general securities could also go in there. The key thing to keep in mind as to whether or not an asset is appropriate to go into the trust or not is the IRS tells us what interest rate we are going to use when we make that sale to the trust. And we are going to use the AFR, or the applicable federal rate. Currently, the long-term federal rate is, I think, 1.2%. So as long as we move an asset into that trust that is going to either appreciate at a rate or produce income at a rate greater than 1.2%, that is going to be an appropriate asset to put into that trust, because we are getting more appreciation outside of the estate than what that interest rate is coming back to the grantor. So with that with interest rates at the rate that they are at today, it opens up the door to a lot of assets that are appropriate to be considered as a transfer into a defective grantor trust. So how do we fund that trust? We absolutely can do a gift. That is traditionally some of the most common way to put assets into the trust. Again, we're going to be looking at those assets that have the potential for appreciation. We're in the next slide, we're going to take a look at the way that paying income can help with that appreciation and the legacy planning to the next generation. And also, we're also going to avoid any of the transfer tax on that appreciation. The opportunity today, in my opinion, is the installment sale, which is where we are going to sell the asset to the trust at fair market value. The grantor is going to receive back a promissory note. Oftentimes that's structured as an interest-only note with a balloon payment at the end of the term. That allows for a lot of flexibility as we get to the end of the note term to either refinance or possibly look at trying to swap assets for some of that cost basis planning. We don't have to recognize any tax on the gain during that when we do the transaction, and we can get income back from the trust. So this is really, we don't oftentimes hear that paying income tax is a cool thing. That's a little counterintuitive. However, when we're looking at trying to do some planning with a defective trust, we've got two options as to how we can pay the income tax. So let's just say that we moved some non-voting shares of a closely held business into that trust. There are distributions that come out of from the business that's going into the trust. Either I, as the grantor, I'm responsible for paying the tax. So either I can go into another one of my assets that's in my estate and pay the tax. By doing so, 100% of those distributions that are in the trust are going to continue to grow and appreciate in value with no leakage back for income tax. Or my alternative is that I can actually take some of those distributions back and use some of those distributions to pay the income tax. If I use another asset in my estate, I am going to accomplish two key goals. Number one is I'm going to further reduce my taxable estate. And number two is that by paying the income tax, I am effectively making a gift to the next generation without that counting as a gift. And here's what I mean. So in this example, we gifted $10 million of an asset into the trust. Over the next time period, over the next 30 years, if we use the cash flow from that asset to pay the income tax, we will have transferred $24 million to the next generation without any estate tax. It's right, 2.4 times the asset that we put in, we have now transferred without any type of transfer tax on that. That's a pretty good deal. However, if instead of using the cash flow from that asset to pay the tax, if I use another asset in my estate to pay the tax, that appreciation, 100% of that appreciation stays in the trust, and we will instead transfer $43 million, 4.3 times the original asset value that we put into that trust. So as we start looking at that, it is oftentimes a challenge that we have to get the grantor to understand that paying tax can be a benefit, and not use the cash flow from the asset to as the funding for the tax, but there is significant leverage that can be gained by doing so. In it, one of the other areas as we start looking at many of our clients have successful businesses. They are looking to try to transition the business to the next generation. A defective grantor trust can be a very, very effective way to help transfer the ownership to the next generation. Effectively, what we can do is that by selling some of those shares to the trust in exchange for a promissory note, what we are really doing in terms of planning is that we are exchanging an asset that has a potentially high return, high growth asset for one that is similar to a low yield bond. And that's driven off of the fact that the AFR is so low at this time. We get significant estate tax savings. One of the key things is that we need to make sure that this is structured as an arm's length transaction. Otherwise, the IRS can come back and take a look at the transaction and say, you know what, this really, on the surface, it looks like a sale, but really this was a gift. So we're gonna treat this as a gift, possibly use some of your unified credit that we had planned to use for other assets to get out of the estate. So two key provisions. We need to make sure that the trust has assets already in it prior to doing the transaction. Oftentimes that's called seeding the trust. We would never consider selling an asset to somebody else if they said, you know what, I would love to buy that, but I've got no money. We wouldn't sell that. This is no different. So if that, we need to make sure that the trust has assets already in it. General rule of thumb is 10% of whatever the ultimate value of the transaction is going to be is what we're going to want to have in the trust prior to the transaction. So if we're going to sell a $5 million worth of stock, we want to make sure that we have gifted or otherwise gotten a $500,000 of assets into the trust prior to the note. The other key piece is that we would, if we were to buy something, we would have the expectation that that note is going to be paid back. So we need to make sure that we have a term of a note that is realistic in terms of life expectancy. If we have an 85-year-old, it is not a reasonable arm's length transaction to have the term of the note be 50 years. So we just need to build that term to be realistic as to what life expectancy would be. So let's take a look at a case study. So we've got a business owner, Rory Richards, who wants to set up a defective grantor trust for her 3 kids. So she gets a business valuation, and this is a key provision of this planning, is to make sure that we have an independent valuation that we can present to the IRS that as to what fair market value is. And that valuation comes back at $14 million. So Rory sells the $14 million of stock to the trust. Off of that, she can still take discounts. So we can take a discount for non-voting stock, lack of control. We can take a discount for lack of marketability. So perhaps we can reduce that fair market value by 20 or 30%. We really don't care what Rory's cost basis was in that business, because on the sale, we don't need to recognize any gain because trust and grantor are one and the same. The trust is going to receive those distributions and dividends, and that cash flow can be used to repay the note back to Rory. So in terms of a transition plan for her, she needs some cash flow. We can get that. We can make that planning and get cash flow back to her. And she is going to pay the tax on the dividends that are flowing into the trust. So what we have accomplished is her estate is now smaller. We are going to repay that loan. So we're going to get cash flow back to her that she's going to be able to use for her retirement lifestyle. All of the appreciation on the stock from that point forward happens outside of her estate. So we have removed at least $14 million of assets from her estate without using any of her estate or gift exemptions. So if she's married, we've still got over $22 million of unified credit that we can use to further get assets out of her taxable estate. This has happened independent of having to use the unified credit. Okay. It does not just have to be closely held businesses. It also works great for real estate. So another case study, we've got Nick. He owns a lot of different properties. He wants to set up a trust to remove some of these appreciated assets from his estate and pass those along to his two kids. His estate is valued at more than $20 million. So we do have an estate tax issue today that is likely only going to get more significant in the future. And he's got some California property that's worth $4 million. It's been appreciating at 4% per year. And Nick is expected to live about another 20 years. So the asset is appreciating at a rate higher than the AFR. So this becomes because of that, this becomes an attractive asset to move into the trust. So if Nick doesn't do anything, continues to hold on to the property, leaves it to his kids in his will, the property is going to appreciate to just over $8.7 million. So that's going to chew up a bunch of his unified credit. If he gifted the asset into that trust today, we're now going to use $4 million of his unified credit instead of 8.7. So we've freed up some unified credit to use for other planning. And all of that appreciation of 4% on the $4 million is going to go to his two kids without any estate or gift tax liability. Or Nick says, you know what, this is cool. I like that idea. I like getting the asset out of my estate, but I do still need some cash flow. So rather than gifting, Nick could sell the asset to the trust and then take back a promissory note in exchange for the asset. So the rental income that is coming off of that property can be used to repay that note, provide cash flow back to Nick for his lifestyle while keeping all of the appreciation out of his estate and going to his two kids without estate tax. So in terms of kind of a visual as to what these transactions look like. So the first step is that we have to first set up the trust. And then we have to, as we talked about, seed that trust. If we're just going to gift assets into the trust, we don't need to seed the trust. However, if we are going to do any type of installment note, we do need to get some additional assets into that trust prior to that transaction. So once that trust is set up, once it has some assets in there, now we're going to, if we're going to sell a closely held business or a piece of commercial property, we're going to get an independent valuation. We can take some discounts against that valuation, and then we are going to enter into an arm's length transaction with the trustee of the trust and sell those assets to the trust, take back an installment note at an interest rate equal to the AFR rate for the month that the transaction was completed. Because for income tax purposes, grantor and trust are one and the same, we don't care what the gain is. There are no capital gains that we have to recognize during this transaction. So now that the asset is in the trust, we've got cash flow that's in there. The tax liability or tax responsibility for that cash flow comes back to the grantor. So the grantor then has two choices. Either I can use another asset in my estate, pay the tax, keep 100% of the appreciation and the growth in the trust to pass on to the next generation, or I can take some of that income back and use some of that cash flow to pay the tax and keep the majority of the appreciation out of the taxable estate. We've got now this asset that produces consistent cash flow in the trust. And the real decision becomes, okay, what am I going to do with this cash flow? This is about wealth transfer. We are going to be looking at what assets can I get maximum leverage on in order to further enhance the wealth transfer to the next generation. Well, I think that we can all come up with, there probably is not a better leverage asset than survivorship life insurance. We can use individual insurance. Regardless, we have cash flow that's in the trust. This becomes a decision of how are we going to allocate the cash that's in there between different asset classes, of which life insurance is going to be one of those. Those death benefits will get paid to the trust, income tax free. They will then be distributed out to the trust beneficiaries, income and estate tax free. So again, at the grantor's death, the life insurance proceeds will flow into the trust and then out to the beneficiaries, depending upon the wording that the grantor used in the trust. So if there's spendthrift provisions for some of the beneficiaries, all of that will be incorporated into the trust. One of the topics that has been in a lot of the publications of recently are spousal lifetime access trusts, or SLATs. A defective grantor trust can be set up to allow the spouse to have access to some of the income from the trust. So again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, these are very flexible planning tools. So if we do need to get income back to the grantor, we can set that up in a way that oftentimes the spouse has access to it. And through these trusts, we not only can benefit the next generation, these can be set up as dynasty trusts. So a defective grantor trust that can last multiple generations without being subject to estate tax. Many of the states have what they call a rule of perpetuity. which says that the longest time period that a trust can last is 21 years after the death of the youngest beneficiary that was alive at the time the trust was created. So that's the rules that we have here in New York and in many states. However, there are several states that have abolished or modified that rule. The three big ones are Nevada, South Dakota, and Delaware. We actually just worked on a dynasty trust out in Nevada. Their rule of perpetuity is the trust has to expire 350 years after the death of the youngest individual. I do not believe that South Dakota has any limitations as to how long a trust can last. And we are actually seeing more of this trust business happening in South Dakota because their premium tax, so built into every life insurance policy, every state charges the insurance company a premium tax. South Dakota has by far the lowest premium tax of all the states, which typically means that premiums are a little bit lower if we run those in South Dakota than other states. So that combination of the rule of perpetuity and the premium tax, we're seeing a lot of activity in South Dakota. So in conclusion, hopefully you agree with me that a defective grantor trust is an incredibly flexible tool, and it's very effective for estate planning. One of the things that I really like about it is that once we transfer those assets into the trust, we are not locked into one path for the client. As their needs change down the road, we've got a lot of different planning that we can do off of that with swapping assets or refinancing some of the assets that are in there, as well as also some planning as to what to do with the cash flow that's now in that trust. Currently, with the interest rate environment that we are in, it is ideal for trying to do some intra-family loans to try to transfer assets, whether they be business assets or not, within the family. And this also solves that issue that we have probably all had to deal with, which is I just don't have enough trust beneficiaries to use my annual gifting to get the premium dollars into that trust. We've got the asset that provides the cash flow in there. And that life insurance is an ideal leverage asset to help to further leverage that cash flow and perpetuate that wealth for many generations. All right. So thank you for your time. Thank you for bearing with me through my technology challenges. And hopefully this was you found this presentation to be helpful. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer those.
Peter, we had a few questions in the chat.
Sure.
One was, when real estate is in the trust, who gets the benefit of depreciation for income tax purposes that are used to reduce income tax?
Yep. So great question. So for income tax purposes, everything's going to roll back to the grantor. So if there is depreciation, that's going to roll back to the grantor. So yeah, great question. And that opens the door if, if we've got, some entities where we're looking to try to do some cost segregation, take a look at some appreciated or accelerated depreciation. Those benefits would then roll back to the grantor for tax purposes.
And we have one more question. Can you ever sell an asset once it enters the trust? For an example, income producing commercial property.
Absolutely. Yep. So especially with, let's take closely held businesses as an example. One of the strategies, if we know that we're going to sell to a third party, especially today with where the multiples are with the private equity market. Prior to entering into that transaction to sell, let's get the valuation, let's move non-voting stock into that trust. We're going to be able to take significant discounts on that transfer. At the time that then the company is sold, we now have cash, many multiples of EBITDA in the trust and outside the estate. The same would hold true for commercial real estate. If we know that we've got property that is in a very desirable location, let's transfer that asset today. And then at whatever point in the future that is sold, that appreciation is not coming back into the estate. It is being sold, and 100% of the appreciation is outside of the estate. So absolutely. I think that that's one of the real benefits of this type of planning, is for those assets that we really feel this is going to be sold. It is going to be sold at a significant gain. And we want to structure this in a way that that we're getting that appreciation outside of the estate.
That was all the questions we had in the chat. I wanted to open up the discussion if anyone else had any other questions. Peter, I think we're all set.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. So we will have our next series. It'll be the third Wednesday of September. And we will announce the topic shortly. And thank you for joining us.
Oh, I had one more question.
Oh, sure.
What is the process for setting up the trust, cost, etc.?
Sure. So it's definitely, we're going to want to collaborate with either the client's estate planning attorney or bring in an estate planning attorney that you work with. I mean, in terms of trust planning, trust itself is not overly complicated. I would say that the cost is probably going to range from, depending on the law firm, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000. If you engage the attorney in doing some of the other estate planning, of course, the cost could be more significant than that. But I would say for the trust, somewhere between $2,000 to $5,000.
Oh, Peter?
Yeah.
A couple of questions. One is, I would assume that the trust is set up so that it avoids probate because you have named beneficiaries. And one of the things you did not comment on, or at least I did not hear a comment, was the saving in probate expense. Now, the attorneys won't like my talking about that, obviously, but I think we've both seen situations where we said, oh my God, that's a lot of money. So obviously, if we can have significant assets transferred, not only estate tax free, but also probate cost free, that's a little bonus. The other thing, my memory is about as old as I am, and unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the case. It was years and years ago in California. A lady set up a trust involving real estate. You may remember the name of it. It was a landmark case. That's why I don't remember the name. But at any rate, she had 2 children, and at that time, the annual gift exclusion was $3,000. So what she ran afoul of course, was the limitation on the amount of the gift she could make without gift tax. So her very clever attorney came up with the concept of having 2 classes of beneficiaries. One was the income beneficiary, those who would receive income from the trust at its termination or at her death. And the other was the gift beneficiaries. And included in the gift beneficiaries were everybody that she knew and had control over. So as a consequence, she was able to make substantial tax-free gifts, and her children would obviously be the only beneficiaries of the trust itself. Now, the interesting thing is the case was challenged in the tax courts a number of times, and the government was never able to prevail. So apparently that's a very safe ground on which to walk. But as I say, I can't remember the lady's name. I'm wondering if it occurs to you. I keep thinking Cassiani, something like that.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but yes. You know.
Well, that was probably before your lifetime anyway.
And
As
yes,
I remember.
To your point, you're absolutely correct. This is an irrevocable trust, so the assets are going to pass to the named beneficiaries of the trust and not go through the probate process. So, definitely.
Yeah, the other thing you addressed a couple of times, the problem of making gifts that exceed the annual exclusion. And this approach that was used by the lady whose name I can't remember might be a good way out. So anyway, it's just something to stick in your memory file, and hopefully it'll come out better than mine is. So thank you very much for your presentation. It's a concept I had heard about years ago, and I think you did an excellent job in the presentation. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Welcome.
Take care.
Thanks, Jim. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. If you do have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll make sure that we get those answered for you. Have a good one.
Thanks, Peter.